He returned to his deceased mother's house to start over. But what he found inside was something no one would dare reveal. Hidden compartments, letters, and truths that had been concealed for years turned his life upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. When Malcolm Reed drove into the neighborhood where his mother had lived out her final years, the late afternoon light had already turned heavy and gold, thickening over the rows of identical houses. The lawns were tidy, trimmed to the same measured height, and the driveways gleamed with new concrete. But halfway down the street, amid that suburban neatness, there stood a house that looked like it had been swallowed whole by the earth. From a distance, he thought it was just overgrown shrubbery. But as he parked the truck and stepped closer, the truth became clear. The house itself was there, only smothered by a green pelt of moss and ivy. The roof sagged under the weight of the vines, windows gaped black and empty, and the air smelled faintly of damp soil and rust. He turned off the ignition and sat for a long while, staring at the place. The letters from the county had described it as in need of restoration, but that was the kind of bureaucratic understatement only someone who'd never walked into ruin could use. His hands, still calloused from years of construction work he no longer had, tightened around the steering wheel. He had come here because he had nothing else left. The job was gone, the marriage dissolved, the house sold to cover debts. The only thing that bore his name now was this: his mother's decaying home in a quiet Ohio suburb that everyone seemed to have forgotten. When he finally stepped out of the truck, the first thing he heard was silence. No barking dogs, no lawnmowers, just the wind pushing softly through the vines that had made the house their skin. Across the street, a woman watering her flowers paused to watch him. When their eyes met, she turned away, as if she hadn't seen him at all. Another neighbor, a man in a baseball cap, stood on his porch pretending to check the mail, though the mailbox was clearly empty. Malcolm felt the weight of their curiosity and judgment. In a neighborhood like this, every outsider was a question mark. He carried a duffel bag to the porch, the boards creaking under his boots. The key, mailed to him in a manila envelope from the probate court, stuck halfway in the lock, and he had to force it with his shoulder before the door gave in. A cold, stale draft greeted him. The interior was a shadow of memory-bare floors, wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin, furniture draped in sheets that looked older than he was. He took one cautious step inside, and dust was like breath. Somewhere deep in the house, water dripped rhythmically, a sound both ordinary and unsettling. He called her name once. Mom? Though he knew she wouldn't answer. It was just habit, one he hadn't shaken even years after the distance between them had grown unbearable. He'd left town at 20, chasing work and freedom, and their calls had grown shorter over the years. The last time he'd spoken to her, she had sounded tired, but calm, telling him she was fine, that a neighbor named Corinne was helping her with her medication. He'd promised to visit next month. That month never came. Now, standing in her living room, he felt the kind of guilt that pressed behind the ribs like a slow bruise. He moved through the house carefully, every footstep echoing. In the kitchen, he found a stack of unopened mail, the top envelope stamped, "Final Notice." On the counter, beside a brittle bouquet of dead flowers, sat a small plastic case with prescription labels faded by time. He picked one up. The name read, Elaine Reed. The dosage was strong, too strong, he thought, and the refill date was 2 weeks after her recorded date of death. He frowned, setting it back down. Upstairs, the air was colder. A draft came through a cracked window, and the smell of mildew clung to everything. In the master bedroom, sunlight filtered through vines that had forced their way in between the frame and the wall. The bed was unmade, as if she'd left it one morning and never returned. On the dresser lay an old photograph of the two of them, taken when he was a boy. His mother's smile was wide and genuine, her eyes full of the warmth that later years had stripped away. He traced a finger along the glass and whispered, "I'm sorry." That night he slept on a folding cot in the living room. The house groaned with age. At some point, he thought he heard a whisper, a soft, dragging sound from upstairs, but it was only the vines shifting against the windows. He told himself it was the wind. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was listening. The next morning, he began clearing debris. He worked for hours, dragging out broken furniture, sweeping cobwebs, tearing down curtains stiff with dust. The physical labor steadied him. It was something he understood. When he pried open a rotting cabinet, a small envelope fell out, addressed in his mother's careful handwriting. For Malcolm. Inside was a short note. "If I forget who I am, let the house remind me." He folded the paper, unsure whether to be comforted or disturbed. That afternoon, while hauling a box of bottles from the basement, he heard someone approach. The knock on the open door was soft, but deliberate. When he turned, a woman stood on the porch, a little over 50, hair tied neatly back, dressed in nurse's scrubs, though it was Sunday. "You must be Elaine's son," she said, smiling with practiced warmth. "I'm Corinne. I live just 2 houses over. Your mother and I were close. I took care of her for a long time." Her tone was smooth, but her eyes were sharp and assessing, like she was taking stock of him, of the house, of everything that might one day belong to her. "I remember your name," he said, wiping sweat from his neck. "She mentioned you." Corinne stepped closer, glancing around. "Poor thing. She was lonely after you left. I did what I could, brought her groceries, made sure she took her medicine. If I hadn't been here, she would have been gone years earlier." There was a note of self-importance under the kindness. He nodded, unwilling to start a confrontation. "I'm sorry for your loss," she added, her gaze drifting to the broken window frames. "If you need help, I still have a key somewhere. Used to come by and check on things. She trusted me completely." The statement hung in the air like a subtle claim. "Thanks," Malcolm said finally. "I'll manage." Her smile tightened. "Of course. Just know this place has been a bit of a problem for the neighborhood. Overgrown yards attract complaints. I've already spoken to the city about getting it maintained. You might get some letters." He watched her walk away down the driveway, her back straight, her pace confident. Something about her calmness unsettled him. 2 days later, a letter arrived. The envelope bore the seal of the county property division. It stated that the house was under review for inclusion in the vacant property acquisition program, citing absence of verified ownership. According to the letter, no registered heir had yet claimed the property through probate. At the bottom, in fine print, was a list of the complainants among them, the name Corinne Sutter. Malcolm exhaled slowly, folding the letter into his pocket. The timing was too convenient. He drove to the municipal office the next morning, waiting in line behind homeowners arguing about zoning permits and tree trimming ordinances. When it was his turn, the clerk, a young man with tired eyes, confirmed what he feared. "Yes, someone reported this address as abandoned. But if you're the heir, you can file to clear the title. You'll need to open probate officially and provide documentation of next of kin status." Malcolm nodded. The process was tedious, but clear. Paperwork was something he could fight with. Lies, on the other hand, that was harder. That evening, he sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the maples. The neighborhood quieted, sprinklers clicking on in rhythmic bursts. He could see Corinne's house from where he sat. Its windows bright, the garden perfectly trimmed. She was out front, speaking to a man in a city inspector's jacket. They both glanced his way once before continuing their conversation. Inside, the air was heavy again. He switched on a flashlight and descended to the basement, determined to keep cleaning. As he moved aside an old shelf, a small crate caught his eye. Inside were glass vials, some still half full of cloudy liquid, others labeled in faded ink. He picked up one. The label bore his mother's name and the dosage of a strong sedative. The date, again, was weeks after she'd died. Another bottle, this one unmarked, was sticky with residue. He gathered them all into a box. When he emerged upstairs, the smell of the house seemed stronger, sweet and metallic, like decaying flowers. He set the box on the counter and stared at it, a cold unease crawling up his spine. What had she been taking? And who had given it to her? He pulled open the kitchen drawer where his mother used to keep her papers. Inside were receipts from the local pharmacy and a folded note scrawled in the same uneven handwriting as the one upstairs. Corinne says this will help me sleep. I keep forgetting what I took yesterday. I think it's working. I feel calm. Maybe too calm. The last line was underlined twice. Malcolm leaned against the counter, the note trembling slightly in his hands. He could still hear Corinne's polite voice in his head, the way she'd said, "She trusted me completely." The words took on a different weight now. He stayed up late that night, sorting through boxes, looking for anything that could make sense of what he was finding. The more he searched, the clearer it became that his mother had been alone in her final months, and not just alone, but under someone's control. When he finally stepped outside to breathe, the street was empty. A light flicked on in Corinne's house. Through the curtain, he thought he saw her standing there, watching him. The next morning, another envelope arrived, this time from the city attorney's office. It warned that unless the property's legal status was confirmed within 30 days, it could be seized under the local Land Bank Act. He set the paper down and looked around the room. The walls were still scarred, the floors uneven, but he felt something shift inside him. This was no longer just a broken house. It was evidence. It was the last thing that connected him to his mother. And maybe, if he listened closely enough, it could tell him why she'd died. That evening, he stood in the living room, the flashlight beam gliding across the cracked plaster and peeling wallpaper. He spoke aloud, not sure to whom, maybe to the house itself. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "You were right. This place remembers." Outside, the ivy rustled in the wind, and somewhere deep within the walls, a single drop of water fell into the dark. The next day would bring paperwork, calls to the probate court, and the slow unraveling of secrets he didn't yet understand. But for the first time in years, Malcolm felt a direction, however grim. The house had waited long enough for someone to defend it, and he, though broken in every way that mattered, was finally ready to fight for something that could not fight for itself. He turned off the light, left the door open to let the night air move through, and sat on the step as the vines above him swayed gently, whispering against the wood like the sound of a mother's hand brushing her son's hair one last time. The morning after the letter from the city attorney arrived, Malcolm woke with the sense that the house had changed around him. Maybe it was only the sunlight that made the place appear gentler, slipping through the curtains like forgiveness, but the quiet no longer felt as heavy as before. He brewed instant coffee on the stove that barely worked and drank it standing up, looking out through the vines that pressed against the glass. The world outside seemed too clean for what he knew now. Corinne's immaculate lawn, her porch filled with flower pots, her deliberate composure. Everything about her life looked as rehearsed as a photograph. He had spent years building houses for people like her, people who valued appearances above foundations. And here he was, the son of the woman she had helped, living inside the truth she'd tried to bury. He drove into town with a box of documents on the passenger seat. The bottles he'd found sealed in plastic bags. The probate office was in an old brick building with a cracked seal of the county on the wall. Inside, everything smelled of stale paper and disinfectant. The clerk at the counter, a woman with hair the color of copier toner, recognized the address immediately. "That house again," she murmured as she searched the system. "You're Elaine Reed's son?" He nodded, and she gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry for your loss. There was an inquiry about that property last year. A woman named Corinne Sutter filed for temporary guardianship of your mother's estate. The petition was denied insufficient medical documentation." The words sank in slowly, like a nail being tapped into wood. Guardianship. He had heard about cases like that, elderly people declared incompetent so others could seize control of their property. The denial meant she hadn't succeeded, but the attempt itself told him everything he needed to know. He signed the forms to reopen probate, his signature shaking only slightly. It was tedious work, certificates, affidavits, proof of relation, but there was satisfaction in it. Paperwork was a language he could learn, and learning it meant defense. When he stepped back into the parking lot, the sky had turned the color of tarnished silver, threatening rain. He sat in the truck for a long time, watching the clouds gather, and felt something like direction returning. By the time he drove home, the storm had broken. Rain hit the roof in steady percussion, and the house moaned under its own weight. He set his documents on the table, wiped his hands, and went back to clearing debris. Beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway, his crowbar struck metal. He pried it up and found a tin box wrapped in a towel. Inside were envelopes, handwritten letters, each addressed in his mother's looping script. They weren't to anyone. They were to herself. He read them by flashlight as thunder rolled outside. The first was dated 2 years earlier. "I feel so tired all the time," it said. "Corinne says it's natural, but sometimes I forget what day it is. She says I'm safe here. I think she's right, but I can't shake this fog." Another letter followed, the writing unsteady. "She's bringing me new pills. The old ones made me dizzy. I hope these are better." The last one stopped mid-sentence, as though the pen had slipped from her hand. "She said it's better if I stay home, where she can—" Malcolm folded the papers carefully, his chest tightening. He didn't need the rest of the sentence. He already knew. That night he dreamed of her voice calling from another room, soft and uncertain. When he woke, the house was still dark, but the air felt thick, almost alive. He switched on the light and noticed that the box of bottles on the counter had shifted slightly, though he couldn't remember touching it. He tried to laugh it off, but something about the silence pressed too close. By dawn, he was back in the truck, heading to the clinic where she'd been treated. The receptionist was polite, but cautious, when he asked for her medical records. "I'm her son," he said, showing his ID and the probate documents. After a pause, she returned with a file folder, its tabs neatly labeled. He leafed through the papers and froze. Every prescription, every refill, every dosage adjustment signed by the same hand. Corinne Sutter, NP. There was no supervising physician listed. He thanked the receptionist, copied the records, and left. The moment he reached his truck, he felt a pulse of anger rise sharp in his throat. Corinne had been her nurse, her friend, her poisoner. He stopped at the pharmacy next, hoping for confirmation. The pharmacist, a man in his 60s with fogged glasses, squinted at the dates. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I remember your mother. Quiet lady. Corinne used to pick up her prescriptions. Said Elaine couldn't leave the house. Always paid cash. I thought it was odd she never had an ID for her." Malcolm thanked him and walked out into the parking lot, rain still drizzling. The evidence was forming a chain letters, signatures, receipts, but each link made the air around him heavier. He drove back to the house in silence, replaying Corinne's smile in his mind, the way she'd said she trusted me completely. Now the words felt venomous. When he arrived, there was a note taped to the front door. It read, "Leave it alone, Malcolm. You're not helping anyone." There was no signature, but the handwriting was familiar, neat, and medical. He crumpled the note and tossed it aside. That evening, a city inspector showed up. His badge identified him as Ruben Delgado from Code Enforcement. He was courteous enough, but his eyes darted around the property like he was assessing a prize. "We've had complaints," he said. "Overgrowth, debris, structural issues. You'll need to make repairs, or the city may step in." His voice held the casual confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. When Malcolm asked who filed the complaints, Ruben shrugged. "Anonymous, but we take them seriously." Malcolm wanted to slam the door, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I've already filed probate," he said. "I'm the legal heir." "Good," Ruben replied. "Just remember, paperwork doesn't stop Code Enforcement. Fix it soon." After he left, Malcolm noticed Corinne watching from her porch again, arms folded. Her expression was unreadable. The following days blurred into a pattern of labor and dread. He cleaned, repaired, replaced. Each nail he drove into the wall felt like a small act of defiance, but the more he uncovered, the stranger things became. Behind the pantry shelves, he found another hidden compartment, a small wooden drawer stuffed with old pharmacy labels, some torn from bottles. A few were written by hand. One label bore a date 3 weeks after the death certificate. He took photographs of everything, storing them on a flash drive. If Corinne had friends in the city office, he needed irrefutable proof. Then came the night of the first real threat. He had just sat down to eat when glass shattered in the living room. The rock landed on the floor beside him, wrapped in paper. "You don't belong here," it read. The handwriting wasn't hers this time. Sloppier, rushed, but the message was clear. He called the police, but when the patrol car arrived, the officer barely looked at the scene. "Probably kids," he said. "That house has been empty for a while. People get spooked." Malcolm watched the cruiser pull away, feeling smaller than he had in years. No one wanted to see what was happening. He was a man with no allies, defending a dead woman's memory against people who already owned the narrative. He started keeping a journal of every event, every conversation. At night, he searched the internet for cases of elder abuse and fraudulent guardianship. The stories were endless: nurses exploiting patients, forged wills, estates swallowed by legal gray zones. It was a whole hidden world built on silence and trust, and his mother, trusting as always, had been caught in it. Days passed. The repairs continued. The neighbors still avoided him, though occasionally he caught snippets of whispered gossip. "He's crazy. He's digging up trouble. That house should have been condemned." One morning he found fresh tire marks in the mud beside the property line, leading from Corinne's driveway to his fence. He followed them to the back gate, which hung slightly ajar. Inside the yard, the soil looked disturbed, as though someone had been digging. He crouched down and brushed away the dirt. Beneath the top layer was a buried trash bag, filled with shredded paper's medical forms, photocopies of his mother's ID, and something else. An unsigned letter drafted to the county clerk, declaring Corinne as caretaker and successor in interest for the Reed estate. She'd been preparing to steal the house long before Elaine died. Malcolm burned with anger, but forced himself to stay measured. Evidence mattered more than fury. He sealed the documents in a new box and hid them under the floorboards of his truck. The next step was clear. He needed legal help. He called the county prosecutor's office. The secretary who answered sounded weary until he mentioned prescription fraud. Then her tone changed. "We'll take a look," she said. "Bring everything you have." 2 days later, he sat across from an assistant district attorney in a small, fluorescent-lit office. The man flipped through the papers, frowning deeper with each page. "This is serious," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, this woman may have violated several state laws: elder abuse, falsification of medical records, even attempted property fraud. But you'll need corroboration, toxicology, handwriting analysis, witnesses." Malcolm nodded. "Whatever it takes." When he returned home that evening, the sun was setting behind Corinne's house, turning the windows red. For the first time since he'd arrived, he felt something close to fear. Not the kind that makes you run, but the kind that tightens your breath and sharpens your mind. He realized then that she had probably known all along he would come back. Maybe she'd even counted on it, on the chance to scare him away for good. But he wasn't leaving. Not after what he'd read in those letters. As darkness fell, he lit a small lamp in the living room and stared at the walls. The paint peeled in long strips, revealing older colors beneath layers of time his mother had lived through, each shade a memory. He felt her there in the silence, not haunting, but waiting. "I'm still here," he whispered, "and I'm not done." The house seemed to breathe with him, the walls contracting as the wind pressed against them. Somewhere outside, a car door closed softly. He looked through the window, but saw only shadows. He went to bed late, exhaustion winning over anxiety. Before sleep took him, he thought about the clerk's words, the prosecutor's frown, the buried bag of papers, and Corinne's quiet smile. The puzzle pieces were aligning, each revealing not just what she'd done, but how long she'd been planning it. In his dream, he stood in the same kitchen, but the lights were on, the air clean, the walls repainted. His mother was there, humming softly, turning to smile at him. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice was calm and clear. "You found it. Don't stop now." He woke before dawn, the echo of her words still ringing in the dark. The wind had shifted, the storm had passed. Outside, the vines on the walls glistened with dew, as though the house itself was washing away the years of silence. For the first time, Malcolm knew that the truth was no longer buried. It was rising, slow and unstoppable. Just like the morning light spreading over the roof of the home no one had watched for far too long. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and windless, the kind of morning that felt suspended between two worlds, one still clinging to denial and another about to wake into truth. Malcolm stood at the mirror in the small bathroom of his mother's house, tightening the knot of a borrowed tie. He hadn't worn one in years, not since the last construction firm dinner before his life had started to fracture. The reflection staring back at him was older, lined not by time alone, but by something deeper, a weariness that came from fighting ghosts that could write their own reports and sign their own prescriptions. Behind him, through the half-closed door, the house murmured with familiar creaks, its wood swelling in the morning humidity, as if reminding him that it was still alive, still waiting for him to do what he had promised. He drove to the courthouse with the box of evidence on the seat beside him. Inside it were the letters, the pharmacy receipts, the prescription records, the copies of Corinne's petitions for guardianship, all the fragments that had once been only suspicion and were now a chain strong enough to hold truth. The streets were empty except for the slow pulse of school buses and a single street sweeper that left the pavement shining behind it. When he parked, he sat for a moment, breathing through the tension that had wrapped itself around his chest. He thought of his mother's last note, the one that had said, "If I forget who I am, let the house remind me." For months, he had been trying to remember who he was, too. Not the man who had run from responsibility, not the failure with debts and regrets, but the son who still had something left to defend. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of waxed floors and coffee. The clerk recognized him and led him toward the small courtroom where the hearing would take place. Corinne was already there, seated at the defense table beside a lawyer in an expensive suit. Her posture was perfect, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She looked up when he entered, her face breaking into that same measured smile he had seen the first day on the porch, the one that tried to disguise control as kindness. But there was a flicker behind it now, a sliver of unease. She hadn't expected him to come this far. The prosecutor greeted him with a nod. The assistant district attorney, Julian Marks, looked younger than Malcolm remembered, but there was confidence in his movements. "You ready?" he asked quietly. Malcolm nodded, though his throat had gone dry. When the judge entered, the room shifted into silence. The hearing began with procedural language, the kind that made justice sound almost mechanical, but Malcolm listened carefully to every word. The prosecutor began by outlining the allegations. That Corinne Sutter, while acting as a nurse practitioner for Elaine Reed, had overprescribed and personally dispensed sedative medications without proper authorization. That she had continued to issue prescriptions under Elaine's name after her death. That she had forged medical documents to support a petition for guardianship and attempted to gain control of the deceased's property. Each word felt like a stone placed on the table between them, building a weight that even Corinne's lawyer couldn't casually brush away. The first witnesses were called. The pharmacist testified that Corinne had picked up every prescription herself, always insisting that Elaine was too frail to come in. He remembered her voice, polite but firm, the way she'd used her professional credentials to silence questions. Then came the handwriting expert, a woman with calm eyes who displayed blown-up copies of the signatures. One written by Elaine in her letters to Malcolm, the other on the forged medical forms. The difference was clear even to untrained eyes. The forged hand, too deliberate, the rhythm unnatural. Corinne's attorney tried to object, arguing that she had acted only out of compassion, that any discrepancies in paperwork were clerical errors. But the prosecutor's tone remained steady. "Compassion does not authorize falsification," he said. "It does not extend to poisoning someone with trust and benzodiazepines." When it was Malcolm's turn to speak, the judge asked if he wished to make a statement. He rose slowly. "My mother trusted this woman," he said, his voice low but steady. "She trusted her more than she trusted me, because I wasn't here. I left. And while I was gone, my mother was told she was safe. She was told she was loved. But what really happened was she was kept quiet until she couldn't speak for herself." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm not here to fix what I missed. I'm here to make sure no one else ends up like her." Corinne didn't look at him as he spoke, but he saw her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table. When he finished, the judge thanked him and called for a short recess. Outside in the hallway, Julian handed him a paper cup of water. "You did well," he said. "You gave her nowhere to hide." Malcolm nodded, though his mind was still spinning. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see Corinne talking urgently to her lawyer, her mask of composure slipping for the first time. She was frightened, not of him, but of exposure. When the court reconvened, the prosecutor presented the final piece of evidence: the toxicology report obtained from the hospital's archive. The report confirmed prolonged exposure to sedative levels inconsistent with prescribed dosages. The timeline matched precisely with the months Corinne had been caring for Elaine. The defense tried to object again, but the judge silenced them with a raised hand. "The evidence is sufficient to move this case forward to full prosecution," he declared. "The court finds probable cause for charges of elder abuse, prescription fraud, and attempted property theft." The words felt unreal. For months, Malcolm had been digging through dust and shadows, and now the truth had stepped fully into light. The bailiff approached Corinne, instructing her to stand. For a moment she hesitated, her expression flickering between disbelief and fury. But then she rose. The handcuffs clicked softly, almost politely, as though even they were tired of the pretense. When she was led past him, she finally looked at him directly. Her eyes were cold, but there was something else there too. Something that almost resembled pity. "You think this changes anything," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "That house will eat you alive." He said nothing. The bailiff guided her through the door, and the sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor. After the hearing, the prosecutor explained that the city's land acquisition program had been halted for review. "Your property's safe for now," he said. "Once we finalize the case, you'll have clear title." He shook Malcolm's hand firmly. "You did right by her." Malcolm drove home in silence. The afternoon light was sharp and colorless, the streets gleaming after another light rain. When he turned onto his mother's street, he noticed for the first time how ordinary it all looked again. The trimmed lawns, the steady rhythm of sprinklers, the mail trucks humming down the block. Corinne's house stood dark and empty. The neighborhood had already erased her from its daily picture. Inside, the house felt different. The air was lighter, almost expectant. He left the box of documents on the table and began walking through the rooms, touching the walls as though reacquainting himself with their texture. The repairs he'd made over the weeks gave the place a fragile sense of renewal. He could almost imagine his mother moving through these halls again, humming softly to the radio, stopping to check the oven or water a plant. For the first time since her death, he allowed himself to remember her without guilt. He spent the following weeks rebuilding. He replaced broken floorboards, patched the roof, scrubbed the walls until the smell of mildew was gone. The work was slow but grounding. Each nail driven, each brushstroke of paint felt like an apology turned into action. The neighbors began to greet him again, cautiously at first. Some brought over tools, others coffee or advice. They spoke of how sad it was what had happened, how no one had really known what Corinne was capable of. Malcolm listened without judgment. He didn't need their absolution. He only needed the house to breathe again. One afternoon, while sanding the floor in the hallway, his hand struck something hollow beneath a plank. Curious, he pried it up. There, wrapped in an old scarf, was an envelope. The handwriting was his mother's, faint but steady. "To my son, if you find this." He sat on the floor, heart pounding, and opened it. The letter inside was short. "If you're reading this, I knew you'd come back. Don't carry anger for me. It's too heavy for one lifetime. The house is yours now. Fill it with light. Don't let anyone take it from you again." He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the mantel. For a long time, he just sat there, watching the dust swirl in the late afternoon sun. It wasn't grief anymore that filled him, but a kind of quiet gratitude. She had known, somehow, that he would return. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch, looking at the street as the lights came on one by one. Children rode their bikes past the fence, dogs barked in distant yards, and the wind carried the smell of cut grass. Life had returned, simple and unremarkable, but precious for that very reason. A few months later, the prosecutor called to tell him the final verdict. Corinne had pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation in an investigation of other cases. Her medical license was permanently revoked, and she would serve several years in state prison. The land bank program was suspended pending review. "Your mother's case changed more than you think," Julian said. "People are paying attention now." Malcolm thanked him quietly. When he hung up, he walked through the house one last time, touching the walls as he passed. The vines outside had been cut back, replaced by new garden beds he'd planted himself. The front porch, once sagging, now stood solid beneath fresh beams. The house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt like a promise kept. That night, as he sat in the living room, the lamp casting a soft circle of light, he opened his mother's letters once more. Her words, fragile on the page, no longer made him ache. They made him remember. Every syllable was a fragment of her strength disguised as frailty. She hadn't left him with wealth or success, but with something far rarer, the proof that truth, once uncovered, could breathe life back into even the quietest corners of the world. He rose and went to the front door, opening it to the cool night air. The neighborhood was silent except for the rustle of trees. For a moment, he thought he heard her voice again, faint but unmistakable, the kind of whisper that lived in the marrow rather than the ear. "Thank you, Malcolm." He smiled without turning back. "You're welcome, Mom," he said softly. The wind carried the words across the yard, over the fence, through the freshly pruned vines. The house stood behind him, strong and still, its windows reflecting the moonlight like open eyes. After everything, the lies, the silence, the courtroom, the long nights of fear, it no longer needed to be watched. It was alive again, awake in its own right, bearing witness to the quiet resilience of those who refused to turn away. And as Malcolm closed the door for the night, he knew the house was safe. Not because it was his, but because at last it remembered who it belonged to. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to discover another powerful story, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.